our speakers. I'll introduce them in reverse order of their speaking. Kate Kenski. Kate is obviously the one up here. Okay. Her PhD is in 2006 from the University of Pennsylvania. She is now an associate professor in the Department of Communication and the School of Government and Public Policy here at the university, where she teaches political communication, public opinion, and research methods. Prior to teaching at the U of A, she was a senior analyst at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. She has published over 30 articles and book chapters on political communication. She is co-author of the book titled Capturing Campaign Dynamics, the National Annenberg Election Survey 2004, with 4 co-authors. Her most recent book is The Obama Victory, How Media, Money, and Message Shaped the 2008 Election, appearing in 2010 Oxford University Press, with Bruce Hardy and Kathleen Hall Jameson. This book has won several awards, including the Prose Award for the 2010 Best Book in Government and Politics, and the 2011 International Communication Association Award, Outstanding Book Award. The Obama Victory book has been named one of the top 10 must-reads for the current campaign season. Kevin Coe, right here in front of me, is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication, also at the University of Arizona, of course. Professor Coe's research and teaching focus on the interaction of American political discourse, news media, and public opinion. His scholarship has appeared in a variety of top communication journals, and he has written opinion pieces for a wide variety of popular news outlets, including the Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun, and Time.com. He is the co-author with David Donkey of the award-winning book, The God Strategy, How Religion Became a Political Weapon in America. And here in the center, Thomas Miller, professor of English and the associate provost for faculty affairs at the University of Arizona. He has directed both the writing program and the graduate program in rhetoric, composition, and the teaching of English. He has published 5 books and over 50 scholarly articles. Professor Miller's book, The Formation of College English, Rhetoric and Belles Lettres in the British Cultural Provinces, won a national award for the Modern Language Association. The second volume of his History of College English Studies appeared in 2011, The Evolution of College English, Literary Studies from the Puritans to the Postmoderns. So I'd like you to please welcome these wonderful speakers, and I look forward to it as much as you do, I hope. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for making time to spend some time with us. What we're imagining is that we start with some prefatory remarks, hopefully it'll be somewhat provocative, and then we'll have some time for discussion. I wanted to start off and talk in broad strokes, because I'm a rhetorician and we love broad strokes. And then my colleagues who are communication scientists can talk with a little bit more precision, perhaps, about some more recent issues. I am a rhetorician. Rhetoric is the oldest of the liberal arts. The liberal arts were founded as an educational philosophy to prepare citizens to argue various sides of issues. The founder of the liberal arts tradition in ancient Greece was not Socrates, the enemy of rhetoric, but Socrates, the student of one of the leading sophists. We remember the sophists in pretty negative terms because we read Plato and not the sophists. In fact, none of their works are extant. They were destroyed by the Catholic Church in the first centuries of its history. Rhetoric is about the art of arguing various sides of an issue to explore an issue. It's founded on a relativistic sense of ethics, the assumption that there are 2 sides to every issue. Therefore, give me an argument for, and I'll give you an argument against. It's also humanistic in that one of the other commonplaces of the sophists is, of God I do not know, for life is too short and he is too vast. Another assumption is that man is the measure of all things, which is probably one of the original assumptions of the sophists, and also one of the original assumptions of humanism. Rhetoric provides a broader, pre-modern way of thinking about some of the issues that modernity has left us with a rather impoverished conception of. And that's what I'd like to focus on just briefly, is persona. As somebody who works in the English department, I rub elbows with literature scholars. I study rhetoric rather than literature. So I'm asking you to imagine the question of character in a literary context as a way of understanding a political context. In a novel, when we talk about character, we have a much more multifaceted understanding of that concept than we do when we talk about character in politics. In our everyday parlance, where we talk about the character of this or that politician, we almost always mean it to be a positive or a negative thing. The idea that it might be a descriptive concept that we could use to explore the dimensions, the nuances, the vagaries of someone's thinking and personality is difficult for us. So if we can imagine representative politics as akin to the representations that we encounter in literature, we may be able to think a little bit more broadly about the storied imagination of which we are a part as Americans. We are at a historic moment in the making of America. We are at an historic moment in the narrative of America. And so it's useful, I think, to step back from the current moment and ask ourselves to think, perhaps as a humanist, about questions like character. Politics is about values, but there is another concept about which we have a rather limited understanding as moderns. We have an understanding of values as either good or bad. It's useful to trace our concepts back of the moral back to its ancient roots in Latin. The term moralis gave rise to two terms, moral and more. Similarly, the concept of ethics comes from a Greek word, ethos, which has given us the concept of the business ethic, as well as the ethics as a moral system. In thinking about the current campaign, it's useful perhaps to think about the character of Governor Romney as having a certain business ethos and talking through some of the political and ethical ideas that are associated with that ethos, and understand that things like the free enterprise system or the free market have a set of values embedded in them that can be elaborated upon and discussed. Whether we identify with them or not, it does seem to me that as humanists and as citizens, it benefits us to think about them in a more multi-dimensional way than we often do when we talk about character. Another aspect of the tradition of rhetoric that speaks to the present moment is how character is displayed in action. How, as an 18th century writer said, speak so that I may see you. So that the idea being that how we speak to each other, the characteristic modes of expression, makes our inner feelings, our inner ideas visible to others around us. We have experienced two debates in which the character of the individuals that were displayed on those occasions had a dramatic impact on how we understand their candidacies, and they have, according to most pollsters, had a dramatic impact on shifts in the demographics in the polls. We, in the first debate, experienced a president who seemed somewhat professorial in a non-positive way. He seemed rather truculent and withdrawn, did not engage in the moment, did not engage with his interlocutor in what appeared to us as an authentic and humane way. In the second debate, we suffered through someone who leered at the camera a great deal, made dramatic gestures that seemed overblown for the interpersonal context of someone sitting right next to him. We saw a lot of teeth, and according to many commentators, that persona did not play very well. Now, if you put your own individual politics aside and think of it more as a scene in a novel or an act in a play, you have a sense of the play of character that I think will help you understand the dynamics that are going on in the polls. What we will hope to see this week, if we are Democrats, is the president come forward in a way that will appeal not only as a vision for the next 4 years, which has been sorely lacking in many of the presentations, but also as authentic and engaging and caring and speaking to the moment and the time and the place. That sense of timeliness, that sense of provisional, transactional ethos is something that the president very much needs to display in the next debate. I think if you are a Republican, you took great comfort in Governor Romney's character in the first debate. He came forward as someone who had a vision and had ideas, and he stated his vision in a pretty straightforward sort of way. As a rhetorician, it was interesting to see how simply listing 5 of the commonplaces he had been using before as his 5-point plan convinced a lot of people that he had put forward a specific political agenda. Those kinds of rhetorical gestures can have a big impact on an audience. And I hope we'll have some opportunities to talk further about the question of character and how it's playing out in the current election. But now I turn to one of our two colleagues who are here who really do a lot of research in the contemporary scene in a way that my broader rhetorical background is not up to. Kevin?
That's very interesting. And where I'd like to pick up on this idea of persona in politics is in the idea that religion and politics go together in a very important way for persona. I would suggest that religion has become a central aspect. It's expected of politicians to include as they present their persona to the public. And we're actually at a very interesting moment in American political life because we're at a place where a persona that is put forth by a politician, it has to have just the right amount of religion. So you're criticized if you have too much faith. As we found with George W. Bush, he was criticized early on for having too much faith, and he actually scaled it back in his second term noticeably, and I would say on purpose because of the criticism. And then we've seen the other side of it. You're also criticized if you have too little, and that's what President Obama has faced from various critics over the course of his time in office, where people feel like his public persona is not enough about his religious faith. He was, for example, called out by the Congressional Prayer Caucus for not using God references enough in his public discourse. So we're at this interesting moment, and I want to try to bring something to the discussion here by just offering 2 very brief case studies of presidents and how they've adjusted their public persona with respect to the way they put religious faith forward or don't as they engage with the public. So the first case study is Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, he fundamentally transformed the extent to which faith was a component of the average president's public persona. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I've studied modern presidents extensively. Modern presidents, I mean going back to Franklin Roosevelt all the way up through Barack Obama. And what you find is striking when you look at the extent to which faith was a part of presidents' public communications is that on a variety of measures, and I'll give you some examples in a moment, but on a variety of measures, Ronald Reagan elevates the amount of faith that is part of the public persona. So some examples as promised. The average major presidential speech prior to Reagan taking office, this is from FDR all the way up to Jimmy Carter, it actually didn't have any references to God. So about 46% of those speeches had at least one reference. So the majority actually didn't have any mentions of God whatsoever. Ronald Reagan takes office, 96% of his public speeches while in office had at least one mention of God. So he's very consistent in the extent to which he's using God. But it's not just the consistency, it's the sheer volume as well. So he increased by about 120% the total number of mentions to God in his average major public speech. His references to broader faith terms, to spirituality, church, Christian, and so forth, any general religious reference you could think of, increased by about 60% from his predecessors. He, as a few more examples, he increased the frequency, roughly doubled the number of times that presidents on average would go out to the public and address a religious organization of some kind, at a church or at an annual conference of something like the National Association of Evangelicals. So he made those a staple of the presidency in the way they hadn't been in the past. He roughly doubled the number of religious proclamations that presidents issued. He roughly doubled the number of Christ references in the average Christmas speech for presidents. So I could go on, but I think you get the sense that Ronald Reagan, he adjusted his public persona in a way that really changed the nature of faith as a part of public persona in the presidency. And what's interesting is these were enduring changes. So once Reagan leaves office, he gives way to George H.W. Bush, and then to Bill Clinton, and then to George W. Bush. Those numbers stay elevated. So it's not as though he came in and did something unique, and then it went away. He came in and did something unique, and that became the norm in the presidency until Barack Obama, whom I'll talk about in a moment. But the question that I think is interesting then is, well, why did he do this? Why did he make such changes? And in part, the answer has to do with just his own belief system. Of course, presidents are people like anybody else, and they believe in certain things. And Ronald Reagan made it very clear throughout his public life and in his private writings and so forth that he very much believes that America is a chosen nation. He very much believes that, and that came through in his public communications. So I think his own beliefs are part of the story. But what's an equally interesting and important part of the story is that it's not just about your own beliefs as a president. It's about crafting a persona that responds to the political circumstances of the moment that you're facing. And what was interesting about the time that Ronald Reagan took office was that there was a very important shift going on in the nature of political mobilization among religious people in America. Particularly the shift was Christian conservatives who had for years not really been willing to engage in the political sphere for a variety of reasons. They decided that they would, and they took some concrete steps and formed some very important organizations, the Moral Majority becoming the most famous, that consciously tried to engage with the political system to make conservative Christianity and the associated values more a part of the political world. So this was happening. Ronald Reagan understood that there was now political capital to be gained from speaking in terms and doing things public persona-wise that would appeal to this newly organized voting bloc, and he did just that, and it worked out very well. He gained political support in a way that he certainly found valuable over the course of his time in office. So that's one case study. The second case study is Barack Obama. And so as I hinted at, Barack Obama didn't follow the Reagan trajectory. When Obama came into office, he did some things that departed pretty notably from both the volume of total religiosity in his public persona, but also the kind of religiosity that made up his public persona. So again, a few examples just to illustrate this. His total volume of religious communication, and here across all speeches, not even just the major ones, but across every public statement he's uttered, he decreased his references to religion by about 40% from the four presidents, Reagan through George W. Bush, who had preceded him. He cut in roughly half the number of visits he made to audiences of faith, to churches and religious organizations, and so on. He roughly cut in half the number of Christ references he made in the average Christmas communication. And again, I could go on and on. But just to illustrate that he's made some shifts. What I think has been the most interesting of these shifts is not the extent to which he's decreased things, but the way he's expanded things as well. So one of the things we've seen with Obama that we haven't seen nearly as often in the past is the breadth of religious groups that make up his public discourse. So whereas the norm in past presidencies was to reference Christianity or Judeo-Christianity has become more common as well. But what Obama's done is he's also referencing Muslims to a remarkable degree. He's referencing Hindus and Buddhists, and he's even referencing non-believers. You may recall from his inaugural address, there was a striking moment in his inaugural address where he talks about we're a nation of Christians and Jews and Muslims, and he gives the whole list. And at the end of that list, he says, and non-believers. And what was striking about that moment, if you study the presidency, is that was the first time in modern history that a president had mentioned atheists, mentioned non-believers in a non-negative context. So you get a lot of references to atheists going back, especially during the Cold War. But they aren't positive references. I assure you, I've looked at them. This was the first time that you get a president including non-believers in a positive context. Now again, the question becomes, well, why? Why the shift? And this is where I think it gets really interesting, is Obama probably does this in part because, like Reagan, he believes certain things, and that starts to infuse his public persona. So he grew up with parents, well, with a mother who raised him in part who was not particularly religious. He grew up raised also by his grandparents who were not particularly religious. He recounts this narrative in his book, The Audacity of Hope. And then he's also exposed at a young age to non-Christian faiths. Being abroad, he's experienced, especially with the Muslim tradition. So he has a different experience, and I think that's probably shaped his beliefs in ways that might influence his public persona. But that's, again, only part of the story. The other part of the story is that when he came into office, the mobilization that was happening and the change in trajectory of religion was very different than it was when Reagan took office. So when Obama took office, he came in at a time where the so-called religious left, which had been progressive Christians mobilizing in direct response, took a long time, but mobilizing in direct response to the mobilization of Christian conservatives, had become a part of the political narrative as well. And so I think he's speaking to that. But even more importantly, he's speaking to the changing religious affiliation of Americans. So what the surveys have shown is that between 1980, when Reagan took office, and 2008, when Obama is elected, not take office, but is elected, you have a decrease as far as percentage of the population goes in Christianity, Protestants and Catholics, and you have a decrease in Judaism. Where you have an increase, the only place you have an increase, in terms, again, of proportion of the population subscribing to certain faiths, is in the non-Christian traditions. You have it in Muslims, and Buddhists, and Hindus, and notably, you have it in the unaffiliated, the people who subscribe to no particular religion when asked. Those are made up of atheists, of agnostics, and other people who just don't subscribe to traditional religion. And that proportion of the public now, the unaffiliated, is now 20% of the American population. It's the largest group, except for Protestants and Catholics, but again, depending on how you split Protestants, unaffiliated is the largest group. If you break out evangelical Protestants and Methodists and so forth, they're all smaller in terms of sects than are the unaffiliated. So it's a remarkable shift. And I would suggest that Obama's public persona that he's crafted, that has moved consciously away from the kind of religiosity we saw and broadened that religiosity in very tangible ways, is again a reaction to the changing environment. So what I want to try to suggest by way of these two vignettes, or these two case studies, is that persona in politics it's always going to be a combination of your own belief system, which you try to make a part of who you are as a candidate, much the same way we try to make our belief system a part of who we are as people. But what politicians also have to be very conscious of is the environment that they're operating in. And I think that plays as much a part into the persona they ultimately put forward as does who they are. They have to try to reconcile those two things, and that's what we saw with Obama, that's what we saw with Reagan in the case of religion, and I would say beyond religion, that's the nature of persona as it plays out in the political sphere. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
All right, I'm going to depart a little bit from my colleagues and talk about what I see in the data when I'm looking at where people get their sources of information. My background as an undergraduate was actually in rhetoric. I got my degree from Willamette University. Very much appreciated the liberal arts education and very much applaud the College of Humanities for embracing trying to educate people to become better citizens and better thinkers. I think sometimes other elements of the college education can kind of funnel us into technocrats rather than thinking holistically. And so I think what the College of Humanities is doing is so vitally important. With that in mind, let's see here. Actually, With that in mind, I want to talk about where people get their sources of information. In addition to my undergraduate degree actually being in rhetoric, I went to the University of Pennsylvania for my doctorate, where I studied with a rhetorician who had created the Annenberg Public Policy Center. And for the most part, I am very much driven by poll data, what do I see in poll data, but very much influenced by larger questions in trying to seek how we understand the political process. Right now I'm interested not only in politics, but just generally the ways in which people are guided by confirmation biases. That is, humans have this tendency to scan the information environment and to highlight for themselves information that is consistent with what they already believe. A couple years ago, George Lakoff came to the University of Arizona and gave a talk, and it was a dynamic talk, but my heart dropped at one point when he challenged whether progressives should continue the mission of trying to bait things out in a rational manner. And this pretty much goes against what I was trained as, is how we should value things, looking at both sides. And I think part of the dilemmas that we see today in a political environment in which we are concerned about civility is that people on both sides of the aisle simply are not really listening to the other side. These are trends in ideology from a day, so you can see how people see themselves in terms of ideology. And for the most part, it has remained fairly consistent across time. At least since 1992, people don't like to self-describe as liberals for whatever reason. But certainly, when we look at American politics, ideology is not completely how people actually go about voting. Some other trends to be aware of. First of all, polarized assessments of presidential performance. When people take a look at their assessments of the current president, the data suggests that they are very much guided by where we situate ourselves ideologically or by party. That is, of course, if you are a Democrat, you are going to be more favorable towards a Democratic president. And if you're a Republican, you of course will be more favorable towards a Republican president. Again, just trying to confirm what you already believe. The recent data suggests that we are now at a moment where we have never been more divided. And what's really important here is where past research, and here I'm talking about Fiorina, basically suggested that this polarization stems from the elites. There are a series of studies coming out now that suggest that it isn't just an elite problem, it is now firmly among the citizenry. And here, if you've seen Talia Stroud's book, Niche News, she very much focuses on this problem. And so, what used to be considered an elite problem, it's really our leaders that are causing this problem has funneled down. One of the things that has made this funneling happen, of course, is media fragmentation. Interestingly enough, for a while, people thought that new technologies would be the savior of our democracy by offering more opinions. And of course, what has happened is with the advent of cable news, we've simply funneled ourselves into seeing the world the way we want to see it. A sort of our own little solipsism, where this is the universe because this is how we're choosing to see it. Ultimately, scholars would say that this is actually undermining the goals of deliberative democracy and making it harder for people to make informed decisions. In addition to work by Michael Deli Carpini and Scott Keeter, work by Marcus Pryor in Princeton shows how, since the advent of cable news, the electorate has actually become less knowledgeable. And people are now selectively putting themselves into certain news audiences. And what's really interesting is because there is so much quote-unquote choice, we probably think that we're actually doing a good job scanning the information environment. People have described this as echo chambers. What's mostly been studied has been the conservative echo chambers. And so if you're conservative, you can feel good about your selection of choices going from Rush Limbaugh to Wall Street Journal to Fox News. 3 sources, right? By the same token, of course, people on the other side of the aisle do the exact same thing, going from New York Times, MSNBC, and then to put the cherry on top, check out Jon Stewart, right? And again, we feel good about this because we've gone to multiple sources, quote unquote, of information. So a question that one of my former students, and Kevin's as well, Rico Newman, and I asked ourselves is, how polarized was the American electorate in their media choices during the 2008 presidential election? And I want to show you some of the results here. Just really quickly, since I know most of you probably don't care.
What was the question again?
It was, how polarized was the American electorate in their media choices? And here we're talking about news choices during the 2008 presidential election. And just to give you a little sense of the methodology, we had data from the National Annenberg Election Survey. I was fortunate to be at Annenberg at the time when this survey was first created and then stayed on as a consultant in 2008. The National Annenberg Election Survey is the largest academic study of the American electorate. In 2008, we interviewed about, I think it was over 57,000 people. This uses data from the general election. It is a rolling cross-sectional survey, and here, as you can see, it was the general election was the time frame. We asked a series of questions. I'm not going to bore you with all the details on that, but essentially, for independent variables, we were interested in things like, how did people self-ascribe in terms of party identification, their ideology? Did they turn to multiple sources of exposure? And questions about, of course, their socio-demographics. For dependent variables, we were concerned with things like how many sources of information did they attend to? Were those sources liberal or conservative sources of information? How did they feel about the politicians at the time? And we ultimately came up with a measure of the diversity in their media diet. And basically the results. We found that people attend to, on average, 3.6 sources of information. But remember, as I said at the outset, we think we go to different sources of information, and technically they are different people or different programs, but that doesn't mean that they are different points of view. And people use different modes of communication, and so TV being about the one most commonly used, but of course some people still read newspapers as well as internet sources and radio sources as well. And here are the basically takeaway points of concern. 27.1% of people attend at least one liberal and one conservative source of information. So they're doing both. Only a quarter. Much larger percentage, over half, 55%, either only go to a liberal source of information or only a conservative source of information. And so when we wonder, how have we gotten to this situation where we're so polarized? Well, we're making ourselves go there. And then we have nearly 18% who don't attend to liberal or conservative sources of information. Here's some data. What I've done here is disaggregate it by party identification. And so on the top here, we ask the question, does the person use at least one liberal source of news information or doesn't? And then on the bottom two here, uses at least one conservative source. And then again, disaggregating by party identification. And as you see here on that first line, when it comes to using at least one liberal source of information, it's about 60% of Republicans attend to at least one liberal source of information. 73%, 74% of Democrats attend to at least one liberal source of information. By contrast, using at least one conservative source of information, 55% of Republicans attend to at least one conservative source, and 20% of Democrats go to at least one conservative source. And so those are the differences here, which is interesting. We're seeing differences clearly in where Republicans are going and where Democrats are going. Now, part of that is constrained by the fact that if you look at how different sources of information out there are rated on TV news, for example, which again is where most people go. There's Fox News, and on the firmly entrenched right, not a whole lot else. On the other side, there's a bit more diversity there, or I shouldn't say diversity. There's a bit more options to go there, and so that's part of this drive. And as you can see, same question, but disaggregating it by ideology, we have the same finding. So concerns here in terms of where people are getting their information. Now I think we could ask ourselves, well, if I strongly have experienced another side repeatedly making claims that I find fallacious, why should I attend that other side? And I think I'll probably leave that part for discussion on why we should do that. What I would say just briefly would be that if you really want to do well in politics, you have to know what the other people are saying and try to see it from their point of view, even if it annoys, vexes, and offends. All right, and then here again, just the top lines here, attending to at least one liberal and one conservative source of information. We have Republicans at about a third doing that, about 70% of Democrats doing that. Interestingly enough, I should point out that this study completely goes against some prior hypotheses we had going into it, but this is what the data showed. With that in mind, I think we have a couple more minutes. One of the reasons why we should be very concerned about people staying in their entrenched camps and living in these echo chambers, of course, is that how we hear the claims being made and the interpretations differ very much by source. And I just very quickly want to show you, we're not going to have time to show the original clip, but I want to show you differences in impressions about Obama after the "you didn't build that" comment. So I'll first show you the MSNBC.
If you got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen.
Yeah, the way I heard that, he's talking about the bridges and the roads. You didn't build that. He didn't say you didn't build your own business. He said that. And then the next sentence is someone else made that happen. That, not your business. The reference is clear, and that commercial makes it look like he's saying, oh, you didn't build your business. Somebody else did. He's talking about the roads and the infrastructure without which you can't make a business work. That's all he's saying.
Right, let's grant that the phrasing of it was maybe inartful or poorly worded, but the point is basically that businessmen travel every day on a road. The road is paid for by the people. Businessmen every day use the internet. Internet was created by the government, paid for by the government to its foundation. I mean, the point is accurate. It's just the way he phrased it was maybe politically inartful.
What actually talking about was that businesses by themselves didn't create the roads and highways, that if you actually did have a business or you actually made it in society, and you had a teacher who helped you on the way.
All right, and on the other side.
Somebody helped to create this unbelievable American system that we have that allowed you to thrive. Somebody invested in roads and bridges. If you got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen. The internet didn't get invented on its own. Government research created the internet so that all the companies could make money off the internet.
That was President Obama telling America's small businesses and entrepreneurs, you didn't get here on your own, but rather the helping hand of government made your path to success possible. This is all in an effort to justify his call for increasing taxes on the so-called rich in this country. That moment came from a speech in Virginia last Friday, and it's generated a growing debate in the days since. Joining me now for a fair and balanced debate, Melissa Francis. Money with Melissa Francis on the Fox Business Network. I love it. Also Charles Payne, who's a business owner himself, as well as a Fox Business Network contributor. And Hank Scheikoff. I always mess that up, Hank. Scheikoff, Democratic strategist for the Clinton-Gore presidential campaign. Welcome all.
Thanks.
All right, so let me tell you what Rush Limbaugh just said about this. We don't have a soundbite, but this is what he says. I think it can now be said without equivocation that this man hates this country. He is trying to dismantle, brick by brick, the American dream. Now, Russia's going to say what Russia's going to say, but this is where the right is going to go with this comment. And when you had Lou Dobbs on earlier saying this is going to be a seminal moment in this campaign where Barack Obama is looking at small business owners, the backbone of the economy, and saying, you didn't do it by yourself, and you owe, there's some sort of, obligation to pay more taxes because your employees rode on bridges and roads and so on. You heard the president espouse it earlier, Melissa.
I don't think anybody who's had any success in their life says to themselves, I did this all by myself. But I do think that by saying this, he's alienating millions of small business people across the country. I also think the government has to take credit for revenue that comes from businesses, because the government doesn't do anything on its own. It doesn't create any economic rent. It doesn't generate any revenue. I mean, all it does is take tax money from me. That's how they generate revenue. But I think that this is a big moment, and he's alienated a lot of people.
Well, there's a question about how small business owners like yourself, Charles, feel.
To make time equal on both sides, I'm going to stop it there. But of course, the point again is, depending on where you situate yourself ideologically, probably one of these two clips offended you in some way, or at least annoyed you or surprised you, or maybe didn't surprise you, but hearing it is actually useful to understand where the other side is coming from with their arguments. And when we talk about persona, clearly where someone begins very much shapes their interpretation and what they are willing to hear.
So, I believe at this point we can turn to you for some discussion. I will rove about with the microphone and give Kate this one so that she can answer questions from teaching in this class. I know that it's important. Oh, we don't have a wireless one.
Yeah.
We do? Okay. So if you want to ask some questions, I'll be happy to come to you with a mic so that folks can hear your question, so that we can have a genuine dialogue. Would someone like to start us off?
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you, for your talks. So interesting, each one of you. I just have a question for you, because I was just wondering, so the liberal media and the conservative media, one is given to believe by a lot of sources that the media is liberal. So that right away, doesn't that sort of, the way the question was asked, isn't that sort of skewed? If one is a conservative and one believes that 90% of the media is liberal, then surely you're going to say you choose a liberal source, whereas liberals will say, well, we really don't have that many outlets. So how does that work?
Actually, is this coming through?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, the way in which we categorized the various media sources was done independent of that. So it wasn't you go to a conservative source being the way in which we asked the question. We took a series of sources and we categorized them first by how that audience categorized the media. And interestingly enough, I'll say this on both sides of the aisle. When people go to Fox News, they know it's conservative. They're not deluded in some idea that it truly is fair and balanced in a completely tabula rasa sense. They know it's conservative. That's why they go there. By the same token, when people go to MSNBC, they know they're likely to hear those arguments. And so, the first thing I would say is, as much as we criticize how people interpret news, I think they do understand. The second way in which we took the look at these news sources was we vetted it against Pew data. Pew in 2008, Pew being a nonpartisan organization, through journalism.org is their website, took the sources and throughout the election cycle was looking at the tone of, I think it was 52 different sources. And they basically just looked at the extent to which the medium seemed pro-Obama versus pro-McCain. And interestingly enough,
the ranking of how they ended up ultimately ranking their sources, liberal to conservative, very much matched how our audiences from the data ranked the data. And so I actually, surprisingly, people may be deluded in a lot of ways. I actually think if you outright ask them that most people know when they hear an argument what the position is. It's just, are they willing to listen to the other side?
Back to it, then we'll bring it up.
When looking at your data.
Is that open? Is that on? Yeah, no, it should be. It should be.
When looking at your data, I taught high school.
Okay.
When looking at your data, can we say that liberals take a less open-minded affair when it comes to looking at the other side, as opposed to the conservatives, who are now looking more at both sides, still coming out perhaps conservative, but at least opening their minds to see both sides of the issues?
But yeah, I mean, I think that if we, and I wish we had done this, of course we hadn't, but there's a scale in psychology called the Big Five, and one of them has a list of measures on openness. And interestingly enough, in previous studies that have looked at openness, Democrats and liberals self-identify more as being open. In terms of actual choice, that simply wasn't borne out. Now, I should say that we had a hypothesis that perhaps it was dissatisfaction with Bush that was driving the conservatives, and that actually didn't pan out by the data, interestingly enough.
As a follow-up, did you see any differences in age groups of people who are conservative yet still opening their minds to both sides, as opposed to, or did you not take an age factor?
So, you know, we did, but not in the way that you're asking, and I want to say thank you for that, because I'm probably going to go run back and test that. What we did do was a multivariate analysis, and so it wasn't just looking at these crosstabs. We wanted to see if we controlled for age, race, gender, interest in politics, whether or not these findings would still bear out in terms of diet diversity, and they did. So we did control for age, but I couldn't tell you right now which age groups were the ones that made the biggest difference.
People start out as liberal usually, and as they get older, they get a little more conservative. So they've seen both sides of the issue. They are more willing, I think, to look at both sides through media.
Another question up front here. Yes.
I'd like you to...
You have to hold the mic up right here.
Right here? Like this? Okay.
Yeah.
Please let me know how I can be...
Louder.
Please let me know how I can be a better citizen. I would like to actually hear some conservative news, but is Fox the only TV program I can watch?
That's an excellent question. My advice, actually, on this, and I haven't really thought about that way before, is I think that sometimes when we listen to the TV or radio, we have more visceral reactions to the other side. And so I would actually say turn to news magazines and newspapers to perhaps at least temper one's tendency to want to turn off what you really don't want to hear or see.
There's also C-SPAN.
Well, that's what I was going to ask.
Wall Street Journal.
This adds another dimension to this, which, especially in the beginning with Brian Lamb, he used to have face-offs between two media strengths. And I think you underplay this. I think the C-SPAN has grown and grown and grown. And they do present it as best it can be presented, considering the jungle we now live in. So I think that has to be, did you do any work with the idea of the growth of C-SPAN?
Not with the idea of the growth. It was in one of our categories, and off the top of my head, it's just so few people actually tuned to it. So the way we asked the question was, first, we asked about each mode of communication. So first we asked about TV news. How many days in the past week did you watch news on television? They give us a number. If they say anywhere from 1 to 7, we then do a follow-up and ask them, what was your most frequent source? They tell us. We asked them up to 5 sources. And unfortunately, C-SPAN just didn't rank very highly. It was one that I will say that when people were asked where does it fall, they didn't give it a particular spin. So it was categorized as neither liberal nor conservative.
I would be very curious to know how either of you see race being a part of this entire equation. I think it's very interesting that you mentioned race as part of your statistics, but also when you look at race as being associated with certain types of religion here in America, and how that may have broken down some of the rhetoric that you might have observed with regards to the candidates and how they refer to various aspects of God or spirituality. I think it's very interesting that when we look at the big elephant in the room, but no one wants to mention it, that oftentimes it is the dynamic that really changed in the 2008 election. But yet, when we really ask people what was different, sometimes we really don't want to talk about at least that. We tend to talk about other aspects that may sort of skirt around the issue.
Sure, I appreciate that question. Is my mic still coming through here? No.
Talk into it.
Yes, I was waiting to get the answer.
Kevin's going to speak to it, but no problem at all. We'll be happy to have it. I think it's interesting. The case of Barack Obama, it's not honestly,
Just hold it.
I'm just going to hold it like this. It's like a miniature microphone. So the case of Barack Obama is interesting because I would say that, I think many people agree, the most remarkable statement on race that's been made in the political sphere in the last many decades was his speech during the campaign, the Philadelphia speech. And what was striking about that to me is that part of his discussion in that was about religion, is that he used the example of the church as a way to help people understand how race mattered to him and how he viewed it mattering in society. Now, what's striking to me, putting that in context, the broader way things have played out in his political career, is that early on, he seemed to embrace some of the characteristic phrasing of the black church. So he was, I think, again, as far as persona goes, he was very willing to use that as a part of his public persona. An example in his announcement speech in Illinois, where he announces that he's going to seek the presidency. He begins, I think if I turn it this way it'll work better. He begins by saying, giving all praise and honor to God. It's first words out of his mouth. And that's something that from a presidential candidate is virtually unheard of. That kind of phrasing is very familiar in the black church. Now, what changed is the Reverend Wright controversy came along. Yeah. And I think that forced him in some ways to distance himself from some of that familiar idiom. And it then stayed that way when he won the presidency, because now his references to God don't have any of that. And they don't even have any of that. They don't even have any of that in some of the smaller settings where you might expect it. So I think he's had to think very carefully. I'm sorry, the mic's going. He's had to think very carefully about what is effective and what's ineffective with respect to harnessing that aspect of his culture and of his religious life. So it's been interesting in that respect.
You got another comment in the middle here, please.
Just quickly, I don't know if you would agree, but it seems that this president has
you have to hold the mic right next to your mouth.
Has suffered a disrespect which is unique in the history of this country. In various comments, the birther business, and today I heard that someone said that he should go back to Chicago or to Kenya. That he's a socialist, which implies that they don't understand, even have the minimum notion of what the definition of socialism is. If they think Obama's a socialist, they really barking up the wrong tree, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder if this is because there was an undercurrent of racism in relation to him, or is this a result of the polarization that we're speaking about simply via the media? I mean, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is the Congress responsible, or is the media responsible, or we are just a bunch of racist people?
That's such a complicated question.
And by the way, whatever happened to the separation of church and state?
One thing I would say, I mean, that's kind of, again, and maybe this goes along with confirmation bias. It's not, the birther issue, but harkening back to religion, the question about whether or not Obama is a Muslim. Interestingly enough, that percentage that believes that has fluctuated over time. And I know that I believe Gary Langer from ABC News has done some analysis. And he basically came to the conclusion that most people actually don't really believe it, even though they say they believe it. And so if it's part of, I don't know, if I'm a Republican and I'm not supposed to like this person because they're a Democrat and they're running, that you basically kind of say things you don't necessarily believe, but kind of as part of the gossipy attitude. So it's not really unlike what people do in high school. That is, you're jealous of someone because they have really pretty hair, someone uses some unflattering terms about them, and then you spread it around as though it's real belief. And so, I mean, I don't know if this should make us feel better about things that people don't necessarily believe the inaccuracies, or it should make us feel worse because they are willing to engage in gossip, spread things around. I mean, and we're not even getting into the question about why it should matter if he was or wasn't, right? I think that's a whole other set of questions. But just in terms of beliefs, we really want to believe negative projections of the other side, and it's easy because it fits into our mental schema that's already present.
Dr. Rowe, you talked about religion in this particular race. How is Mormonism coming out with Governor Romney?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been interesting because Mormonism has largely not come out in the race, and that's by design. So Romney made essentially two major speeches, one this campaign and one in the previous campaign, the primary, about his faith. And he's otherwise largely distanced himself from his faith. Now, that was the story for much of both of his campaigns. It changed somewhat in the convention, where he gave Mormons a bit more prominence in literally on the stage at the convention, and then in his convention address, he used it to develop a narrative about his life in a way that many people found to be pretty compelling and powerful. But there's no question that because of some of the uncertainty about Mormonism for one of his key constituencies, which is evangelical Christians, and the polling suggests that they've been hesitant, he's scaled that back. What has helped him in some ways is simply that other issues have come to dominate this election. So because of some of the attitudes towards President Obama among that same constituency, they've been able to get beyond Mitt Romney's faith simply because they felt like they couldn't let that hold them back given the stakes as they saw it with President Obama potentially getting reelected if they didn't turn out, for example. So it's been strange because we had reached a point in 2008 where faith was such a striking part of the campaigns that when Romney scaled that back, it was noticeable. In the 2008 primary, it was especially striking because when he gave this major address, a lot of the commentary that came out in the press was, well, he shouldn't have to defend his faith because of things like the separation of church and state and so on. And some prominent conservative columnists actually said that it was un-American to make Romney defend his faith in this fashion. And it was potentially true. It was also deeply ironic because, of course, the narrative for so long had been, no, we need more of your faith. Tell us more. Talk about God. Express your faith. Go to church. Do these things. And then the narrative shifted because of a different faith group being involved. So I think it's been very interesting how it's played out.
I wonder, when Obama started his government, he faced right away a monumental crisis. No other president ever has gone through. At the same time, I think when he started out, he started almost like a messianic person. So people expecting miracles. So, of course, it didn't quite work out. And I just wonder how you would respond. Isn't that also maybe, as you mentioned, the very skillful way of Romney to counteract this messianic approach by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So very pragmatic. And so we are really facing a very different type of rhetorical styles, which could play out both ways. We don't quite know. So
It's a good question, and I think there's no question that expectations matter a lot in politics. And in some ways, one of the reasons that President Obama is president now is because he was able to generate such high expectations in the 2008 campaign. Part of the reason this election is so close is because of those same expectations. So it's two sides of the coin, and it's difficult now to, you can't use the same kind of lofty rhetoric, that won't play now, but then to transition to something very different is hard as well, whereas Romney has the advantage coming in of, he starts fresh more or less for this cycle, and so he can decide on his strategy. And I would say the strategy you've described, which laid out in the debate, is very much consistent with his narrative as a businessman, and he's certainly trying to use that as an advantage, and that kind of, here are the 5 points of the plan. It reads very much like corporate executive in a boardroom. Here's what we're going to do to fix this problem. And for a lot of people, that's a very reassuring rhetoric right now.
One final question, please, Francis.
Did you have a response to that one?
I was going to just add that expectations, as Kevin said, very much shape how we evaluate Obama. And he did create those lofty expectations. That's how he beat Hillary Clinton. When we think about the primary, she had one vision about Iraq. He had a different one. Ask yourself which one came to fruition, right? And I think that so in part, he created the shackles through that, but he wouldn't have won otherwise. Now, by the same token, as we look at the election right now, Romney is offering a certain set of promises, right, if he wins. And if he does, in 2016, would he be able to live up to those same promises? And so, I'm not saying that either men have lied, but they have a certain vision that I'm not sure either can really live up to. But we, as the American public, buy into that vision. We hate the word sacrifice. There was a moment in one of the debates in 1984 where Mondale essentially says, we're going to have to raise taxes. And he says, Reagan's not telling you that, I will. And everyone may recall what happened with him winning one state, right? And so we're all too willing to buy into, again, that lofty vision of a candidate, but it does set them up potentially for a fall down the road.
Last question, Francis.
Professor Kenski, one of the most interesting facets of your data, I thought, was that with the proliferation of cable news sources, that the actual quality of our understanding and our knowledge is reduced. And this seems in some ways contradictory to the way that the courts interpret the First Amendment freedom of expression, that the marketplace of ideas is an underpinning of knowledge and truth coming out, that the best way to combat a false statement is with more speech, not less speech. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that seeming contradiction.
Sure, truth comes out, it's just no one hears it. Right? When we're competing against the latest reality show, it's very easy for people to buy into that. That's their choice. And so that's one of the constraints of choice. And so yes, I would say that, yes, definitely, truths come out, people don't hear it.
Thank you for coming, and thank you to our colleagues from the